Thank you, Madam Mayor, City Manager Mr. Clegg. We are truly honored to be here tonight to have this opportunity to speak to you and share feedback and recommendations that were requested by this august body. Last summer, a review of the Bakersfield Police Department, of their policies and their procedures in service of trust. The recommendations that we will share will speak to what we discovered in our work, what we learned through the process. I'm honored to be here tonight to speak on behalf of Chief Terry and the core working group and the 30-member collaborative. My name is Traco Matthews. I'm the Chief Program Officer at CAPK, and I will allow my esteemed colleague to introduce himself.
Thank you, Traco. My name is Michael Burroughs. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics at California State University, Bakersfield. This initiative is not a CSUB initiative. It is the Bakersfield Police Department Community Collaborative, but I do work at CSUB. That is part of my life and what I spend some of my time on. I think it's wonderful that we have so many people here tonight, and I think it's encouraging to see so many people engaged and involved in this process. And I think we're working towards similar ends, if not exactly the same ends, and we're going to present some of those ends that we've come up with tonight. I'd like you to see this project, which began here, really, with a referral from Andrae Gonzales and this council, as a good faith effort. A good faith effort to assist BPD in being the best organization it can be, the most transparent and trustworthy organization it can be. And when that happens, it's good for BPD and it's good for our community as well. To do this work and to help BPD and help our community in this way, we have developed over the course of 6 months, evidence-based and as much as possible community-sourced recommendations in a number of key areas, which we will talk about momentarily. We've presented this report to you, or you've received the report, so I know you've looked at it before, and we will be providing some context on it and how we arrived at these recommendations tonight. One other framing point I just want to note here before I turn it back over to Traco. A number of the recommendations, or really all of the recommendations, are evidence-based. We're not going to be able to go through all of those resources tonight, but one thing I do want to point out and for us to keep in mind as we engage in this conversation is just the importance of mutual understanding, good communication, and recognizing both the importance of, but also the limitations of the perspectives that all of us bring to this issue, right? None of us sees all this issue entirely holistically, but I think it's important to keep these key concepts in mind. And one data point I keep in mind for this, as I enter this work is one of the studies we looked at was from the Pew Research Center, one of the most expansive studies that's been done actually on surveying police officers about reform efforts and also citizens across the US. It was 8,000 police officers that participated in this survey, 5,000 citizens across the US. And one of many things that this shows is that most police officers, about 7 in 10, actually believe that being responsive to and understanding community interests, local knowledge, right, concerns, is central to them doing work excellently, right? I point that out because that's really what this initiative is about, right? It's not about, I think it's working at common ends, right? If we can understand what the community interests are, what the community needs are, we can engage in public safety practices that much more effectively. Second, there's also important disconnect we see between concerns that police officers have and concerns that community members have. So for example, 8 in 10 Americans say they understand the challenges and risks of policing, right? By contrast, 8 in 10 police officers say that the public does not understand these challenges and risks. So we see a disconnect in experiences, in knowledge, and in communication. We're trying to bridge that gap because we think it can lead to some productive action, and that informs this project and what we're trying to do.
I'd like to speak a bit to the process and the core working group itself. As you can see from the pictures there, we had 5 members of the core working group, including Chief Greg Terry, myself, Dr. Burroughs, Natisha Johnson, and also Dr. Mark Martinez. And you've heard already tonight that these recommendations are not truly representative of the community. However, we did our best to make sure that there was a broad coalition of community leaders who were involved and engaged in this work, so that these recommendations and this feedback would actually be broad-based and representative of as many elements of the community as possible. In a limited period of time, it is impossible to get comprehensive data and information or feedback, but we think we did a pretty good job with the time that we had. Our guidance, primary guidance, was taken from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing from 2015. And I'd like to bring your attention to this statement. The point of this work was strengthened trust between law enforcement and the community. Trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve is critical to a democracy. The public confers legitimacy only on those whom they believe are acting in procedurally just ways. One of the things that we discovered about trust, and you know this to be true as well, it is a function of behavior, yes, but also of perception. And so we looked at both as we looked at these 4 pillars: communications and community outreach, officer training and education, use of force policy and oversight, and building trust and legitimacy. We also have some core commitments that we use kind of as our foundation for this work. Every organization, including BPD, everywhere I've ever worked, they can get better, all right, by doing internal reflection and examination of their processes, of their policies. It's just continuous improvement. Okay. We knew that the recommendations had to be based on evidence, for one, but also a reflection of the community in order to actually achieve what we were hoping to achieve. It's got to be a dialogue, a conversation between law enforcement and the community. Also wanted to note that this is just the beginning of the process. This is not the end. So I believe someone earlier said that, you know, in 6 months we didn't have enough time to come up with comprehensive solutions. We knew that going in. There's no way you can get comprehensive solutions or fix a problem that frankly is pretty big in that period of time. This is the beginning of the work. We understand that. Also wanted to make sure that there was transparency in this process, and so we have done everything in our power to work with BPD and the media and the community to share the entire process and what we have done to this point in developing these recommendations.
So just a couple notes on, these are non-exhaustive notes of our community outreach efforts, but just to give you a little bit more context on some of the work we did do in order to try and solicit community voices to be part of this process. One aspect of that was what we refer to as listening sessions, which is a term we adopted from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. These were 1.5-hour sessions hosted on Zoom, given COVID-19 protections, where community members were able to come share their experiences, both positive and negative, with BPD, concerns about policing, interest in areas of reform, and to ask questions. We thought it was important to have these community forum spaces to listen, for people to be heard, and also to help inform the areas of research we were going to conduct with our community committees. As I noted, we conducted 3 of these listening sessions. We also conducted a 4th special listening session just for BPD officers and leadership to share their concerns, which was also an education for us. And I can't go over comprehensively all the things that were said at these 3 listening sessions. There's too many comments to cover. But there are central themes, and I'll just touch on a few of those. Concerns about police response to people in mental health crises and the training around that issue. De-escalation training. The size of the budget for BPD and concerns about defunding the Bakersfield Police Department. Officer recruitment and training. And also, I just want to note, I think very germane for our conversation tonight, having more opportunities for listening sessions and conversations directly with BPD. I think that was a common theme that came up. And also, very germane tonight is a call to action. Several people, I think skepticism is a good thing. It challenges you, right? I don't shy away from skepticism. And people at these meetings would say, well, this is good you're listening, this is good you're doing a report, but what's really gonna happen? And that's a fair question, right? That's why we're here tonight. That's why we want to work with you to make things happen, and we want to be responsive to that. I think change is an incremental process. It doesn't happen overnight. Many people in this room have been working beyond us. We're not the only ones in the room that have a stake in this. But I think the call to action is something that should be taken very, very seriously, and something that would make this process a legitimate one and a representation of what we're trying to do. Another aspect of community outreach was a community survey, which was really the master behind that was Natisha Johnson, who's in the audience tonight, who ran our communications committee. This is a start, right? This is something that BPD, our recommendations reflect this. BPD could continue and expand this process. But the survey ran just over a month, and in that month, we received basically close to 1,000 responses to questions ranging from, there's 14 of them, but everything from community understanding of BPD outreach efforts to trust in BPD, the professionalism of BPD, and then offering open-ended suggestions for possibilities for reform or asking questions about the process. And I think, just anecdotally, what that survey showed us, right, is that community impressions about BPD are really fractured. They're really divergent. There's not really any uniformity there, right? So just for example, one question, I am satisfied with the overall performance of BPD. 30% of people strongly agree with that. 17% strongly disagree with that. And there's a variety of percentages in between. And the same kind of goes for every question we asked. So I think it's good to note that there's good support for BPD, but it's also important to note that there's people who are really concerned and have a lot of distrust for the police force too. And we need to be attentive to that. So I also just want to note here as we go into the recommendation slides, we don't have time to go in depth on each recommendation. You've already received the report, and we're happy to provide the report to anybody else who'd like it as well. But I did want to note that there's a number of core values that I think, alongside the ones we've talked about, are really central for us tonight in guiding these recommendations. My colleague Traco has already talked about trust and how important that is in the process, establishing that between BPD and the community. The fact that we have community representation in this process, not just speaking to that, but actually real, robust community involvement and community voices in this process. And then also the possibility for us to, as a city, to show great leadership at this time, right? When there are major national and local conversations happening around police reform and what policing should be. We have a chance not to just do the bare minimum, but to do expand what's possible as moral and political leaders. And I think that's something we should take seriously as we think about this process. And I'm sure you already are. With that in mind, and given we don't have time to go through all the recommendations, and with those core values in mind, trust, community, and leadership, I'll just touch base just briefly on two that I think offer an opportunity for increasing trust and showing leadership. And those are two that specifically focus on attending to issues experienced by marginalized populations in our city. Recommendation 3 deals with training in response to police interactions with persons with mental health crises. The reason this is important is that nationally, 25% of people killed in law enforcement use of force incidents are experiencing some type of mental health crises. This is both a danger to those persons, obviously, but also to police officers involved in those incidents. And we have several recommendations that speak to this danger and ways to respond to that. There is a training that we recommended in the report that comes from the Police Executive Research Forum, which is composed of police officials and past and current police officers. It's a very well-respected national organization that has excellent trainings and progressive trainings. They have a training called Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics that specifically deals with training officers to respond to persons who do not possess a lethal weapon or are experiencing a mental health crisis. It's evidence-based. It's a very effective program in reducing use of force incidents in these cases. We think it would be excellent to fund it and implement it here. Second, also, the recommendation 4 around anti-racist policing. Again, we can do the bare minimum. We can have cultural sensitivity training. We can look at those forms of training in the academy, which already happen, and that's great that we do that. But why not be a leader in anti-racist policing? Why not think about this critically and think about how can Bakersfield set the standard for what it means to teach officers and learn about implicit bias, about the history of policing, right? And about how we can be sensitive to the concerns of our community members of color, right? Who have fear and have concerns around interactions with BPD, which is something that was raised at listening sessions. I don't say that to attack the police department. I say it to be honest about what the facts are and to be proactive in facing them as a police force and as a community. Our next committee was communications and community outreach. Several recommendations here. Again, all of these are important, but for the sake of time, and with the core values of trust, community, and leadership in mind, I want to mention just briefly that 2 low-hanging fruit recommendations that really would not cost a tremendous amount of money, actually, when we think about that kind of issue, which I know is a concern, would be continuing listening sessions with the community. This is a practice that we established as a collaborative. As I mentioned before, many people asked for more of those sessions. It built on the principal policing sessions that BPD already conducted pre-COVID that were highly impactful. And I think we should provide more opportunities for community engagement and question asking of BPD leadership where we can. We recommended those be held at least quarterly and held in different parts of the city, both in person and virtually, to increase participation in that process. Also, we started a community survey with our small team in the limited time we had. I think with more time and effort put into that process, I think doing a robust community survey yearly or every other year, right, would be a great way for BPD to keep their finger on the pulse around what community interests and concerns are, things they are doing well, things they can improve, and issues from the community that they haven't even considered, right? Because it's impossible for them to have face-to-face interactions with every community member. We found that process, even in the limited way we did it, very helpful for informing our own selves in this process. I'm sure BPD would find that helpful too. And again, that's not necessarily a resource or financially intensive process. So I just want to leave you with those recommendations, and I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you. In the last two categories, use of force, policy, and oversight. Recommendations here, I'll point out just a couple as well. I know that you are very familiar with the reports from 2004 and some of the affirmations in 2017 from the U.S. Department of Justice. There were quite a few recommendations related to policy changes. A couple of central themes that I'd like to highlight were those of de-escalation, all right, and also proportionality. So de-escalation specifically, we had opportunities to go through simulations. We know that officers are making judgment calls in the heat of the moment sometimes. Some of the de-escalation techniques that we recommended in terms of policy, we thought, again, were low-hanging fruit. Buying yourself more time, potentially calling for more backup or resources, but the evidence suggests this beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have effective de-escalation policies in place, it reduces use of force in a couple of ways. There are fewer incidents, and there's less use of deadly use of force, right, which was one of the reasons why we undertook this work in the first place per George Floyd. So de-escalation was a critical theme that we included. Also proportionality. One specific example would be something like this. Someone has already been arrested, they're in handcuffs, but canines are still being used to essentially, the perception is intimidate, because they can't really go anywhere, they can't run, so why are canines being used in their presence, all right, or barking at them and so forth. So there were a number of recommendations that we made, and all of them were flowing from this concept that the DOJ, but also that we heard from the community. It was this: culture has to change in order for trust to be restored or strengthened, all right? Especially for communities of color. The behaviors can be good. What you have written down on paper can be good, but the perception also must be pristine and solid and good. That means your policies must articulately declare and state your genuine care for every single citizen in Kern County or in Bakersfield, all right? You must declare your positive intent, your desire to genuinely care and respect the dignity of life for every citizen. Those were some of the recommendations that we made related to that first bullet point from the U.S. Department of Justice 2004. Something else that we discovered in our work was when there's greater diversity in terms of the police force, you tend to get better results, all right? And then finally, and this was kind of the overarching category, but we have some very specific recommendations, kind of a catch-all category here. Building trust and legitimacy. All right, so two key themes here. The first is engagement from the community. Ongoing, consistent, persistent engagement. This is a behavior, all right? BPD has to find a way to continually engage the community if they expect the community to consider them to be legitimate and trustworthy. Hence our recommendation for a formal citizens review board, and you could even lead in that space or strengthen the intent and the outcome by hiring an independent auditor. I know that that would cost some money, but it would certainly strengthen the perception of the desire to build and strengthen trust. But the Citizens Review Board, that's a given. We felt that this is low-hanging fruit, very little cost at all besides time, but would help us to achieve that ongoing engagement with the community and BPD. And then finally, the other word that we used is kind of a theme was empathy. So Dr. Burroughs spoke to the number or the percentage of folks who are having some sort of mental health crises. And so we thought it would be important for law enforcement professionals and officers to get engaged with the community that they're serving outside of just protecting and serving their formal role. All right, how do they do that? Lots of different recommendations that we included there, but also not just for folks who are having maybe mental health crises, but the little kid who is like me or like Reedy said, growing up in an area where there are challenges and there are struggles. All right, understanding where people are coming from only helps, and the evidence and the research bore that out. And so we had a number of recommendations related to that. Empathy, engagement. If we can get these things done in addition to all of these other recommendations that we discussed, we believe that truly it could change the trajectory of the relationship with BPD and the community. Any questions? I have a final statement I'd like to share at the very end, but we did want to open it up for any questions from council members.
Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Matthews. Dr. Burroughs, go ahead and make your final statement, then we'll go to the public.
All right, thank you, if you'll indulge me. So thank you again for taking the time to hear our community-sourced recommendations. I would like to read my final closing statement so I keep it under 2 minutes. Please allow me to take off my collaborative hat for just a moment and speak from a heart of vulnerability. As you can see, I am a Black man. I stand tonight in these chambers as a representative of myself, my wife, my father, my 4 brothers, dozens of other family members, my CSUB and BC students, Black coworkers and their children, members of our community collaborative, and many more residents who have experienced inequitable treatment at the hands of law enforcement agencies here in Bakersfield and Kern County. For many, these recommendations are simple recommendations. For me, they are a prayer of hope. I know that no matter what I wear, where I live, how well I do financially, how strong my reputation is in the community, I am still far more likely to be harassed, injured, or even killed by law enforcement than the average person. While the Declaration of Independence states these beautiful words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have never felt like those words included me in the public safety space. My appeal, therefore, is not only to this body of leaders, but elevated to the very courts of heaven. My prayer is to the same Creator the Founding Fathers invoked in their declaration, the same one that Councilmember Smith prayed to at the beginning of this session. My plea to the foundational ethics upon which our nation was established. We have done our best to capture the voices, the tears, and the hearts of our community. I now release our cries for equity into the hands of Almighty God and to the courageous leaders who sit in authority tonight. May this be the beginning of a new chapter of hope for all citizens of Bakersfield, California. Thank you again for considering our recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Thank you, Dr. Burroughs. Madam Clerk, do we have any public speakers?